Three, two, one. Oh, hey, looky there. I'm on. Well, welcome to the auditorium class. You might notice I'm by myself. Don't panic. I talked to Dr. Cloud last night. I don't know, about 8 o'clock or so we were talking. And I told him it sounds like Juanita may have the virus that nobody could tell me what I had back in August, where I had this really bad sore throat. Really bad. Like I thought I had strep throat for sure. And I found out as adults we don't get strep throat that much. So the little doc in the box kind of laughed when I was telling them, I know what I have. I have strep throat. And they were like, no, you don't. So I tested negative for strep throat. I tested negative for flu A and flu B. And I tested negative for COVID. So they didn't know what I had. But it could have been RSV, maybe. But I had just this really bad sore throat, and I was extremely tired. And that's what I normally do when I get sick, is I just go to bed and sleep. Literally, I slept for like 20 hours, and then I got up and it was gone in 3 days, and I was back to normal. Well, Juanita went to get her hair done like she does, for Sundays, like you ladies do, which is awesome. And he said she felt fine, and then she's had a sore throat about lunchtime, and then got really tired and decided to take a nap, and then was still tired after the nap. And I was like, yeah, that sounded a whole lot like what I had. So he wanted to stay with her, and I said, of course. And so we're gonna have a conversation with just us, which is always a little harder for me because I like dialoguing with Dr. Cloud, especially with the things he puts in the slides. And then now I have to do his part, which can be interesting. But we'll see. Or you can be loud and you can make comments, and we'll get through it. But no, nothing big. Just she's really tired, and they're probably online right now wishing that I didn't tell you all those details. But I know that if I don't, you'll ask me anyway. So now you know, and all's good. So we're going to continue our conversation about David and his outlaw status and his outlaw gang, if you will, or his army. I don't know what term you like, but all of those terms are basically applicable, because we see this animosity that grows between David and Saul, and then Saul declares that David is his enemy. We saw that last week when he got so mad at Jonathan, right? And he told Jonathan that he basically wished Jonathan hadn't been born, because Jonathan got in the way of what he felt like was his enemy, who obviously he's identified as David. And Jonathan and David have entered this covenant relationship with each other, and Jonathan has pledged his allegiance to the house of David, not to his own father's house, the house of Saul. And Saul doesn't know any of this is going on other than hearsay probably. And so with that escalating, David starts to have people join him to really probably, most of all of us in here know the story. Even if you haven't read it in a while, it will remind you. Probably more to defend David than to be an offensive against Saul, right? Because all the times that we'll see as we continue to go through this information for the next several weeks is that David has opportunities to take Saul out, and he doesn't, because David is allegiant to Yahweh, and he's not going to do anything God doesn't approve. Saul's not acting like that. So David's army really is more of a defense against Saul more than it is an offense against Saul, where Saul's army is more of an offense against David, if that makes sense. So where we are this morning is, how did all this come about? And of course, like we always tell you, scholars make lots of statements, and sometimes they're excellent, and sometimes they're from people who, for lack of better terms, the way Dr. Cloud was saying it last week, is some people don't even believe. They just get into the minutia of Scripture as an ancient document and as ancient writings. And so sometimes some of the things they will say, you can pick up on the fact that they're not true believers of the story. They're just dissecting it for whatever reason. And we'll always sort of alert you to the ones we know to stay away from and to have a response to, because some of them can be quite popular until something comes along, like an archaeology finding of something like when Dr. Cloud went over the Dan Stela in here and said, in 1993, we actually find something that says the house of David. And so now all of a sudden you've got all these people who have not really believed the story, or have believed it differently than the Bible says, that David is just some little king that's not really of any real significance, and his kingdom is really small. And then all of a sudden you have things being found like the palace columns and the Dan Stela and other things that are saying, no, it was much bigger than that. It's in fact a whole lot like exactly what the Bible says and not what you guys have been guessing. And today we'll have an artifact I wish we had found that we haven't, that we're going to talk about. So we're going to kind of do the opposite. Instead of finding things that prove this, there are people who are saying things about it, and we have not found something. So I'll just give you that as a little preview. Yeah, I think that's probably a good enough intro to where we are. So the other thing I will say real quickly before we get completely rolling is time that has gone by. We don't know exactly how much, but it's pretty close in proximity because we've moved from chapter 17 where David defeats Goliath, and we're in chapter 21, right? And I'm not saying that obviously more time can't go by, that's a linear time clock. But what I am saying is all of this has happened pretty quickly. When we looked at Michal not being given to David as his wife, and then subsequently being given to her after the whole Philistine situation that we talked about 2 or 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, I guess. Then coming back and Saul trying to kill David, and Michal being the one who protects him and lowers him down out of the window. All of that stuff has happened in a pretty close proximity of time. We're not talking about years that have gone by. We're talking about, months, or at least not multiple years, let's say that. So some seasons have gone by, but we're not talking about a great, great deal of time here. So what happens is David in chapters 21 through 23 of 1 Samuel starts his sojourn in the wilderness. He kind of becomes this outlaw, outcast person. And these are the places that he goes. And what we're going to look at today is, last week we looked at Ramah. He went there to talk to Samuel and explain to him all the stuff that had happened. That Saul had thrown the spear at him and tried to kill him. The whole thing with the arrows being shot and get out of here, and that plan that he and Jonathan had, right? But today we're going to go to Nob, and of course he was near Bethlehem, and we had that conversation last week about that's his hometown. And I even suggested, as Dr. Cloud and I were talking, that he probably wouldn't want to go into Bethlehem with Saul pursuing him because that's where David's family is, right? And that could put them into jeopardy if he went in there, escaped Saul, but then Saul decided to do something to his family, which would not be out of the unusualness of tactics of war, right? And then in Gedi we're familiar with. We know that he goes there in a cave. We know that he goes to Adullam, which we're going to talk about today, and Gath, way over there where it says Philistia. We're going to talk about Gath as well. So we're going to see Nob today and Gath and Adullam probably in what we'll get through here in the next 35 minutes or so. But this gives you an idea of where those places are in reference to the Dead Sea, and over there with Moab to the right of the Dead Sea, and then the cities that are there to the left that are in what we would call Israel today. So let's look at 21, 1 through 3, where it says, David went to Ahimelech the priest in Nob. So there's our first, that's why we just looked at that map. There's our first place. He's gone north from Bethlehem up to Nob. And you can also see south of where he met with Samuel. And so he goes to Nob, and Ahimelech was shaking with fear when he met David and said to him, why are you here by yourself with no one accompanying you? Interesting phrase. I was really looking forward to see what Dr. Cloud was going to say on that. Different interpretations of why he would be shaking with fear, right? My best suggestion and how I look at it is there's a reputation that's going before David, right? He's killed this giant. Like I said, not a whole bunch of times gone by, but enough times gone by the word's gotten out and everybody knows what took place. And so maybe this idea of him being there is shocking to Ahimelech, and maybe he is afraid of his reputation. The only part about it that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, or I haven't quite figured it out completely, is why would it matter that no one's accompanying him? I would think I'd be more scared if he had come to me with that reputation and came with a bunch of people. I might think that would be more terrifying than just a one-on-one experience. So I'm not really sure why it decides to tell us that no one's accompanying him. And David replies to Ahimelech the priest, and he said, the king instructed me to do something, but he has said to me, don't let anyone know the reason I'm sending you or the instructions I've given you. Now that explains why he's telling him that he's by himself. Because has the king really given him this? No, not really, right? You could say maybe to try to help in this situation, you could maybe say, well, is he just flat out lying? No, not that either. But he is definitely in a gray area, right? He's the king. The king has been involved in the conversation. Saul, of course, the real king, Yahweh, has been involved in all the conversations, right? So maybe he's alluding to he's doing this at Yahweh's request, but nonetheless, what he's saying to Ahimelech is, well, there's a reason nobody's with me, is nobody knows that I'm here. Nobody's supposed to know that I'm here. This is like a clandestine mission, right? And so Ahimelech takes that as an answer. He said, I've told my soldiers to wait at a certain place. Now what do you have at your disposal? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever can be found. So basically what's happening here is he knows that there's a friendly engagement that will happen with Ahimelech, and he's going there for provisions. And he's telling Ahimelech, oh yeah, I've got people. I just don't have people where I've told them to stay off somewhere else. And we don't yet know exactly how many people he has because we haven't gotten to that in the text yet, right? But this gets very interesting for a couple reasons. This one of the photographs we found was David at Nob with Ahimelech, and he's holding a sword, right? If we keep reading, we find out what sword this is. The priest replied to David, I don't have any ordinary bread at my disposal. Only holy bread is available, and then only if your soldiers have abstained from relations with women. Okay, time out. What does that mean? Well, obviously, David is a believer. Yes, he's got multiple wives. He has a different set of ethics that he's operating under than we do today. Yet, he's still going to operate under those ethics the way God intends, right? So it's not saying that the groupies are not with David, right? Or that there's things going on that shouldn't be going on. What it's talking about is things that could be going on that would be legitimate, but it would make them possibly unclean. And the reason the unclean part is important here is they're talking about holy elements in the tabernacle, basically, right? We don't have a temple yet, so this has got to be some sort of tabernacle type setting, which would be the Holy of Holies where this bread would be. And if we look at it that way, we can understand that what they're saying. They've got to have themselves consecrated in order to even engage with this, because obviously nobody's supposed to go into where that bread is other than the high priest, right? And he says, David said to the priest, certainly, women have been kept away from us just as on previous occasions when I've set out. So in other words, we don't take women with us in that way. Right? We wait till we get home with our own wives, or maybe our wives travel to meet us or something. I doubt that happened, but just putting it in our context, that would be more along the logic than any kind of tomfoolery going on. And he says, the soldier's equipment is holy even on an ordinary journey. How much more so will it be today along with their equipment? So that's an interesting statement. What makes them holy? Right? Did they pour holy water on their equipment? Did they pray over their equipment? Did they dedicate their equipment to God? Yeah, I think the latter is probably true. They dedicated their equipment and everything they're doing to God, right? They're set apart. David's the to-be king, even though we've kind of got 2 kings right now. We've got Saul, who's still reigning as king. David is the anointed to become king. Everything they're doing is because they're representing Yahweh. So I can see what he means. And then even more so because they have abstained from relations with women and they've done these extra steps, and what he's asking for, they'll even be holier today than on an average day, right? So the priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no bread there other than the bread of the presence. And this is very interesting because lots of people point to this as special treatment, because nobody was supposed to do this, right? But there's an interesting little caveat here in the text. It had been removed from before the Lord in order to replace it with hot bread on the day it had been taken away. And see, we're so far removed from this process that we don't realize that this bread was out all the time, right? And to honor God, you don't just leave moldy bread out there or bread that's past its time, right? Not suggesting that they ate moldy bread, but they ate bread that had already served its purpose for being in the holy place, right? So I think we can look at this in 2 ways, not trying to explain it away, but that holy bread is not the same as the holy bread that's in front of the Lord that replaced it, right? He's not walking in and taking the bread that is for Yahweh, that is there as the showbread, and actually eating that. He's eating bread that was showbread previously. Got it? And even so, that would not have been a common practice. But this is a extenuating circumstance, right? And he's a representative of the Lord. If we stop and we think about, again, there's kind of two kings right now. What happens when someone's anointed? Well, the anointed is a representative of the Lord, representative of Yahweh. So he is anointed. So he is God's son on earth. That's the way the king was viewed, right? That's why Jesus is called the King of Kings. So this is a different situation than if just you or I ran in and decided that we were really hungry, we had not planned well, and we would like to eat the bread that's on its way out of the Holy of Holies. It's different because of who it is and the state of the bread. One of Saul's servants was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg. This is not good. This is some foreshadowing to what's coming later. Doeg's not a good guy. And he's there, and we got two problems. One is he sees this exchange that's going on, and number two is he's listening and watching for Saul, so now Saul's going to know about this as well. He's Doeg the Edomite, who was in charge of Saul's shepherds. And I don't know. I don't know if that word there, I didn't have time to look that one up to see if that's intended as a regular shepherd of like flocks, or if that's shepherds of the units that Saul has. But it could be double meaning there for both. David said to Ahimelech, "Is there no sword or spear here at your disposal? I don't have my own sword or equipment in hand due to the urgency of the king's instructions." So we've got this situation that went on with the bread, and we're noodling through that, right? And that seems to me like the bigger question for holiness and for things that are sacraments. And then we get this question about a sword, which is also fairly interesting since David's already told him his men are hiding out somewhere else, but now he's saying he's unarmed because he didn't have time to get a sword. And look at what happens. Ahimelech says, he replies, "The sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you struck down in the valley of Elah, is wrapped in a garment behind the ephod. If you wish, take it for yourself. Other than that one, there's no sword here." And David said, "There's nothing like it. Give it to me." All right, so I wrote down some notes because I wanted to make sure that I got everything I wanted to share with this. So here's the question. How did Goliath's sword end up at Nob? Right? We've only traveled here 4 chapters, and it didn't say, well, let's look at it this way. What did it say last? It said that after he defeated Goliath, he did what? He took Goliath's sword and his head, and he went and put his sword in his tent, right? And then he had the head with him when he went and talked to Saul. And that's really all we heard about it. We don't hear, later we know the head of Goliath goes to Jerusalem, but it doesn't go immediately. We also just assume, I guess, that his sword is still in his tent, or if he's taken his tent down, it went wherever his tent went, right? Until we get here, and then we realize, no, something happened in between that. Something happened in between him putting it in his tent, and it ended up at Nob. So here are some things people suggest. Some people say that after David defeated Goliath in the valley of Elah, that there would have been the possibility that the sword was dedicated to God. That because it was a artifact of the battle and had defeated Goliath, that Goliath had been defeated only because of Yahweh, right? Just like Dr. Cloud said last week, why did he pick up 5 stones? He only needed 1. Well, because the one was being guided by Yahweh, right? So some suggest that the sword would have been a remembrance of Yahweh's defeat of Goliath through David, and so therefore it would go to a place to be held basically as a holy artifact. Maybe. I don't think there's anything morally wrong with thinking of it that way or logically wrong with thinking of it that way, except there's a lot of parts we don't know, right? Like I mentioned a while ago, there's not a temple. The tabernacle is somewhere, maybe even more portable than normal, right? So we're not exactly sure how this process that's being suggested would have been not only legitimized, but been standardized. And then there's the other idea, which is that Nob is called the city of priests, and so that would be where there'd be a whole host of people who would be watching over those things. And so some people think that that would be why it would have gone there, is because that's where the priests are, and that makes the most sense, that that's where the artifacts would go that would be representing Yahweh. Then there's a preservation for posterity. The priests at Nob functioned as the caretakers of sacred items. A remarkable weapon such as Goliath's sword would have established or attested to God's mighty triumph in Israel over the Philistines. And so they think that that might be the reason, if you don't go with the dedication to God reason. And then there's this sanctuary locale, which I was referencing. Like, that's where the main office is for the interface between heaven and earth, right? Nob is seen as sort of the temporary location by some of the temple, because Solomon hasn't built the temple yet, so there's no permanent building. So they're saying that maybe Nob is the geographic location that's kind of seen that way at this time. And therefore they go on to say that the house of the Lord is referred to, the temple, or a temple being built later. This is during David's early life, and permanent temples did not exist, and so therefore this might be seen as the center of worship area. But here's where it gets interesting for us, I think. No matter what you like with that or don't like with that, or if it matters to you, it is at Nob, right? Because the Bible tells us that's where it is. It is wrapped in a cloth. It is behind the ephod. It's the only sword that's there. So that is interesting. Here's where archaeology, I told you a while ago, here's a little preview that archaeology is not going to help us. It's the archaeologist corner of the world that normally comes to the rescue if they're believers about what we found. And if they're not believers, they usually come telling us what we found doesn't prove this, or we haven't found. In this case, they're saying we have not found. We have not found Goliath's sword. Why would we have not found it if it's this prominent? And there's some interesting suggestions, but there's no surviving evidence, physical artifact identified as Goliath's sword, they say. And they say that ancient swords of other material and other implements from the Iron Age, circa 1200 to 1000 BC, have been unearthed in the Levant, but none is conclusively tied to Goliath. Well, I don't have a problem with that. I don't know about you, but they haven't had any issue with Goliath's head not being found in the Valley of Elah either, right? And we know it went to Jerusalem. So what we know, we ought to back up and say, well, why would you think you'd find the sword there? If the sword was at Nob and now David takes it, it obviously leaves Nob, right? If David ends up in Jerusalem with Goliath's head later, he might end up in Jerusalem with Goliath's head and Goliath's sword. So you're looking in the wrong place. It's not going to be near the Valley of Elah, left on the battlefield. It's not going to be at Nob. So I don't have any issues with any of that. Hopefully that makes sense to you, is that that's not a good argument. Arguing from something we have not found, where we may have been looking for it in the wrong place, is not proof that it didn't exist or that it's questionable. What is interesting is this picture of the sword, and I guess this is somebody's best guess, but you will find that when you look at this stuff, you see different engravings. Yeah, David's showing me a picture right now. Found at Gath. Okay, David's saying a picture of the sword was found at Gath, which we'll get to Gath here in a second. It is believed, right, correct me if I'm wrong, that this was a particular advancement in swords over other ones, right? That's why it hacks down so many people after David takes it. Yeah. Right, like what you showed us a few weeks ago, yeah. Yeah, David's just saying it's sword and spear, so don't get caught up on what this looks like. What I'm saying, though, is it was an advanced weapon. It was advanced enough that when this story continues and it leaves here from Nob, Hebrew terms is the sword opens its mouth. That's what we translate to things like it cut people down or it defeated people. The strange term in Hebrew is that it opened its mouth, and this sword opens its mouth against a lot of people. Yeah. Kedon Kwandao, David is saying, means to split. So we get, yeah. Which is great. That corroborates the Hebrew. So we got a Chinese word set that means mouth, sword basically opens, and we have Hebrew saying the same thing. Yeah. Yeah. Got it. Got it. So here is a interesting little picture here that you notice the people change, but you see the sword being handed off. The clothing is kind of strange. The Hebrew here says, sword of Goliath stolen. And so it says David steals Goliath's sword. No, you can't steal something that, first of all, is being given to you. You also, it'd be hard to steal something that you had to begin with, right? Like, it was technically not his. I suppose we could say it was Goliath's, but then when he kills Goliath, it becomes David's, right? Nobody's walking up saying, hey, we need that back. That's not yours. Then it ends up at Nob, and it's given back to David. So I don't think theft is involved at all. I don't know really why that was suggested. But if we keep reading here, 10 through 11, so on that day David arose and fled from Saul. He went to King Achish of Gath. The servants of Achish said to him, isn't this David, the king of the land? Isn't he the one that they sing about when they dance and they sing saying Saul struck down his thousands and David struck down his 10,000? So imagine that. You're way up there, if you remember the map from a few minutes ago, you're way up there to the right. Sorry, to your right, my left. You're way up there to the left. And you're in Gath, and they even know what the women were singing when David came back? Well, that's a lot of reputation about you going out ahead of you, right? Not just the part that you're a warrior and that you've cut down Goliath, which, by the way, they'd know that because Gath is where Goliath came from, right? But that they even know what the women are saying. So what's strange is, why would you go to King Achish in Gath? Because that seems like you're headed to the hornet's nest from where you are, right? David thought about what they said and was very afraid of King Achish of Gath. He altered his behavior in their presence. This is from the New English translation. Since he was in their power, he pretended to be insane, making marks on the doors of the gate and letting his saliva run down his beard, right? So he's acting like he's not in his right mind. And the different translations that we put the verses in here say this in different ways, but here's a strange artist rendition of what he might look like. Now, I don't think he would look quite that evil, but nonetheless, you have what's depicted here is somebody who's been out in the wilderness. You can see the scrapes on his arms. He's not wearing royal garb, and you've got royal garb wearing people talking to him. And they think he's crazy. They think he's out of his mind, right? And then there's little cartoons like this one where you see him with, well, where's the sword? The sword's on his back in this little cartoon. The king of Gath is going to possibly recognize the sword, right? Because Goliath came from there. So he pretends to be insane, scratching on the doors and drooling down his beard is what the New Living Translation says. And I think the little cartoon is helpful just because he's an armed man. They know who he is. His reputation precedes him, and he's carrying a weapon that they might recognize. If it was today and we walked into that situation, we'd probably neutralize that possibility, right? But because he's acting so crazy and letting saliva run down his beard, and he's scratching things on the ground, and his dress is all disheveled, maybe they have some sort of compassion. Or maybe they just don't want to get involved, or maybe they don't think it's fair in his state of mind to treat him as what they would treat him like if he was in a proper state of mind. That's probably what I would suggest was their motivation or their thinking. But look at what the rest of the translations do. This is ESV. So he changed his behavior before them and pretended to be insane in their hands and make marks on the doors, and let his spittle run down his beard. So we're changing a few words from saliva to spittle or to spit or whatever. But the main thing is we're keeping that concept in all the translations of pretending to be insane or to change his behavior, to act in a way on purpose for some reason. New King James says that he pretended madness, and madness would have obviously been a known term in the King James for what that would mean. The New American Standard says, so he disguised his sanity. That's interesting, right? Pretending to be insane, pretending to be mad, disguising your sanity. All those things are pretty much unanimous. while in their sight and acted insanely in their custody, and he scribbled on the doors of the gate and drooled on his beard. So we get drool, which we know is saliva or spit. And then we go back to NET here. Achish said to his servants, "Look at this madman. Why did you bring him to me? Do I have a shortage of fools so that you've brought me this man to display his insanity in front of me? Should this man enter my house?" So he's done such a good job of pulling off that he's not in his right mind that Achish recognizes this, and instead of being directing anything towards David himself, he's directing it towards his men. He's saying, hey, should this guy even be allowed to come in? He's clearly not in his right mind. Now, it is interesting still, I find it interesting, that the sword is not mentioned at any of this point. So they apparently don't feel like he's a threat to their health. They just think that he is dangerous because he's not being rational. And here's another drawing that somebody had where, that text there that said, "So you bring him to me and display his insanity in front of me." And somebody took that display very literally and said that, maybe he was put in a position of kind of brought before the king and he displayed his insanity. We don't know if it went like that, but somebody's an artistic drawer, because I could not draw that well. Yeah, AI probably, yeah. So what is the point in all this? Why would he do this? Well, in 22:1 we find out. David therefore departs there, so he leaves from Gath, right? He leaves from the presence of the king of Gath, and he escapes to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all of his father's house hear about it, they went down there to see him or to him. So that's why we dropped that little possibility that he didn't go to Bethlehem. His family still cares about him, no matter what you see in some of the things right now that are trying to suggest the family's a different way. We don't really know that much about the relationship between Jesse and David. We don't really know that much about the relationship between his brothers and he, except that 3 of his brothers were in the military, and we know that they knew that he came and fought Goliath. And later we're going to find out that some of his brothers joined his band of mighty men. So there's got to be, I don't know if you want to call it love or at least respect there, right? And clearly there's enough that when they found out that he'd had a hard time, whether they know about the situation of him pretending that he's out of his mind or not, we're not sure. But when they hear where he is, they come to him. So there's care there, even if we don't know how to fill in the blanks of why David was not there when Jesse gathered his sons for Samuel to anoint one of them. But I don't think we go into that space and try to make a large story of there being a whole bunch of animosity to the point that they didn't care about David, because this shows that they did. And this is still risky. Caring for David here, like we've said, while you've got King Saul still technically in power, they have to be careful because they could be seen as treasonous acts here. And plus, David is a fugitive from Saul. We got all kinds of compounded problems here, right? So if you get into that, one needs to be aware of what they're walking into. But it works. And so we were asking this question. What we were going to talk about together this morning is what's really going on here? Why is this story the way it is, and why is it so seemingly strange? Well, David didn't have a firm plan in his mind when he left Gibeah, is what we're suggesting. He has been making it up as he goes, because remember the arrangement with the arrows, right? They're trying to determine. Jonathan's saying, "No, my dad doesn't have anything out for you. He doesn't want to kill you." And David's saying, yes, he does. And then Jonathan realizes, oh yeah, David is right. They're deducing this as they've been going. And there's not really been any time to sit down and draw up any massive plans, invite people to be part of your army, and lay out some sort of, not necessarily a battle plan, but some sort of strategic thing you're going to do, right? He's just kind of on the run, ends up at Nob, knows that's a safe place to go, then might start thinking about, well, I shouldn't put people in jeopardy, because he sees Doeg there and knows that's going to come back to haunt him. He doesn't know, obviously, how bad that's going to be. We're going to find out. But he probably does have some sense of, I need to be aware of where I go and who I might be putting at risk where I go, right? So if that's the case, he now needs to choose a direction that's on purpose. And what he ends up doing is really genius. Why Achish and why the Philistines? Well, David is desperate to find safety, right? He needs to be safe from Saul. Technically, are the Gathites and the Philistines and the people of Gath after David? No. No. They might, if he had been in his normal state, they might have decided to be after David because he killed their champion, right? So they're definitely not happy with David. We know that. But Saul's the one who's trying to kill David, so much so that he's told all of his army that if they find David, to kill him, right? So where would be the best place to go where Saul and his army would not go? Where would you be protected from David? Where would David be protected from Saul? Somewhere that's too dangerous for Saul to go, right? And I think that's what he does. Otherwise, there's no way he would even consider seeking refuge with the Philistines. That doesn't make any sense, right? They were Israel's mortal enemy, and therefore if the king of Israel comes into that area, if they're their mortal enemy, there's going to be a clash, right? And he had killed enough of them to prove that fact, including their champion Goliath. So there's exactly what I'm saying. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense that David would do this on first blush until you start noodling into it a little bit more. They were, according to David, they were uncircumcised dogs who worshiped false gods. Now God's secretly appointed leader of Israel runs to them for safety, is the question? Not really. Exactly what I said. Not really. They're not really running. He's not really running to Achish and Gath for safety from them. He's running to Achish and Gath and the Philistines not to protect him as much as they were deterring Saul and his men from coming after David, right? So the way we might say it is David was hiding in plain sight, but in a spot Saul would never go. I was trying to think of something I could put as an example this morning that would just make it pop for us, and nothing really great came, but okay, you got one? What? What? Chess? Okay. Okay. So David's saying chess. You put your piece where there's double defendants. Yeah. What I was thinking, though, was like, where could you go today that if you went, everybody would think you were crazy, but by going there, you're guaranteed that the people who are chasing you would not go there. And all I was thinking of was like different countries, different places that you could hide in plain sight, where even if somebody knew where you went, they wouldn't dare follow you there. And I couldn't really come up with anything. Some of you are probably thinking of it right now and going to tell me after class you should have used this, and that's fine. But I think it's that scenario. I don't think David is trying to hide the fact that he went to Gath. I think he's fine if even Saul knows he went to Gath, but even Saul's not dumb enough to pursue him to Gath because of what we looked at on the previous slide. So hopefully that makes sense. And then 22 verse 2, everyone who was in distress and everyone who was in debt and everyone who was discontented gathered themselves to him, being David, and he became captain over them, and there were with him about 400 men. So what's happening here? We think what's happening here is he's getting a reputation that because he is about strategic moves, like what he's just done to protect himself, and he's loyal to Yahweh, he's a true leader. He's somebody that's leading with power and authority and blessing, but he's also treating people the right way. So all these people who have had these life-taking situations, right? They've got various things that the king right now, Saul, doesn't care about them as people. They see in David that he does. He cares about people. He's not going to do the wrong thing ethically to people, and so they're gathering themselves to him. Now, I don't think they're gathering themselves to him because he's going to pay off their debts, but maybe he's going to let them continue to be free in order to pay off their debts. There's several things there that we're just too far away removed to know for certainty. But if you went to debtor's prison, it's really hard to get out of debt because you can't do anything, right? But if you go to David and David helps you kind of get back on your feet, then maybe you avoid debtor's prison. That's just an example of why people might have gathered to him. And then Dr. Cloud put this slide in, Cave of Adullam. Cave of Adullam was not very far from the place where David defeated Goliath. See, we really haven't moved that much on the map, right? There was Elah, Gath, Nob, and Adullam is coming back down south. How is it that David, who had great faith and bravery once in the hills of Judah, now runs for his life to a place of refuge? Well, again, I don't think his plan has completely materialized, right? I don't think we see this as protecting yourself, doing what he's done as being a lack of faith. I was in my master's work, and I don't have motorcycles anymore. I don't know how many of you know that. I rode one right through here in VBS in 2019, but I used to ride motorcycles, had friends that rode motorcycles. My dad rode motorcycle. All of us are out of motorcycle riding, predominantly because of the crazy drivers now. It's not as safe, and we don't have as much free time. But the strangest thing happened. Somebody, when I was in graduate school, said, "Do you ride your motorcycle to campus?" And I said, "Yes." And they were like, "Well, don't you think that's really dumb? I mean, something could happen to you, and then the whole reason you're going to graduate school, you'd never find out because you rode a motorcycle." And I said, "Well, I don't ride it in the rain standing on the seat in rush hour traffic on 440. I take a smart way to use it to get there, right? And when I get there, I get a free parking spot right up front. I'm in a good mood when I get there, and I'm in a good mood when I get home." So that was my explanation. I said, "Besides, if God knows I'm riding a motorcycle to go learn about him, you think he's not going to let me finish what he is equipping me to do because I chose to ride a motorcycle?" I said, what difference does it really make if I got killed in a car crash? My point was, I'm not testing God, right? And I'm doing something that maybe some people think is not as safe, I get that, but I'm doing it in a smart way, right? Or the smartest way I could. Now you're saying, well, you're really doing it smart now because you sold it. But the point is, that's what David's doing, right? If David were to just say, well, I'm not going to go hide out in a cave. I'm not going to go over here and go to some place that I know Saul won't pursue me. I'm just going to stand in the middle of the road and yell, "Yahweh, help me, Yahweh, help me, Yahweh, save me," in the middle of the street. But I'm not going to do anything of my own volition and my own co-working with him. That's not how it works. He's not any less of a man after God's own heart because he decided to take refuge in the cave, right? He's being smart. He's using the faculties God has given him to do something like go into the hornet's nest in order to protect himself for a little while till he figures out what in the world he's going to do. Because all of this has happened in such a quick amount of time with some very dismaying, probably, feelings, right? I mean, just with what we've looked at in the last 2 weeks. But while he's in this cave, while he's at Adullam, 400 outlaws join David. Now, I think Dr. Cloud said this last week. It's pretty safe to assume that these are 400 men. These are 400 fighting people have joined David, not 400 in totality. They've got wives, they've got children. There's a big group of people that are now connected to David, and there's 400 that are at his command to help him, to protect him from Saul. And so 22, 3-5, David went there to Mizpah of Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, "Please let my father and mother come forth and be with you until I know what God will do for me." See, he's not standing in the middle of the street. He's waiting on God. He's prayerfully listening for God. But look at what he's doing here. He's not just thinking of himself. He's protecting his mom and dad. He said, he brought them before the king of Moab, and they lived with him for a while that David was in the stronghold. The prophet Gad said to David, "Don't stay in the stronghold. Depart and get you into the land of Judah." Then David departed and came into the forest of Hereth. So he's wise enough to think they might be in jeopardy. They might be in danger, right? And he takes them to the king of Moab, entrusting their safety to him while he's having to do all of this underground movement, non-traditional ways of being with his mighty men, right? So we'll pick up here next week. We'll listen also to what Dr. Cloud would have said today that I did not say, and we'll get into a few more maps, and we'll look at how this progresses to where it really starts to become clearer that it's Saul versus David, and David is still staying in step with Yahweh and representing Yahweh unfathomably well in situations that we might, if we found ourselves in the same situation, we might be tempted to just put an end to it. But David continues with his life having all this stress and all this going on because he will not do to Saul something that would dishonor or disgrace Yahweh, because Saul is the representative of Yahweh to Israel right now. So I hope that was helpful. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will pray and we will dismiss and go about our day. Father, Son, and Spirit, Yahweh God, thank you again for today. Thank you for this fall-like weather. Thank you for the beautiful week that's forecasted of not even hitting 80 degrees, but being wonderful weather to enjoy being outside and the change of the seasons. And as our clothing changes for the cooler temperatures and football games and all the different things that you've blessed us with, may we remember that as we do all of these things, that we're still your representative, just like David. Please protect us from having to pretend we're mad, pretend we're insane, or going into some place. We're amazed by stories like this, but we don't request that we have to relive them. Help us see that since we don't have to relive something this challenging, the little challenges that we do have, we can do and still represent you well through all of them. Thank you for how you've equipped us. Send us out now that we may be your ambassadors in all that we say and we do, and may someone believe in you because they see our belief in you.